Now you should be able to hear me properly. I think that Teams does something weird with the volume. Good morning, Sparky Spark. Okay. Can you hear me now? Be able to hear me. Good, yes. When I look at the audio mixer, it helps. It tells me the volume was too low. So, good. So, as you hopefully know, kind of don't have any further formal content for this unit anymore, but I understand there can be quite some questions. So today's Q&A session where I'll try to basically ask you what you want to know, and so if there's any questions, please put them in the chat, either the YouTube chat or the Brightspace chat, and I will be happy to answer them. With the proviso that if you put it in YouTube, then that will be public, whereas if you put it in the Brightspace chat, that will be private. The question I will repeat anyway. So are there any things that people say, okay, here I'm struggling with the assignment, or this is something I'd like to understand, or something like that? Please let me know, and then I'll try and answer your questions. What is the finished project supposed to look like? Okay, so as in, and then researching. So what is it supposed to look like? I do have a full implementation somewhere. So what it, because I didn't make a full implementation, but I think Tim did. So I can show some degree of the full implementation, what it's supposed to look like. I would say, personally, I would think that one could be slightly more pretty. Let me have a look. If I can find it. Let me have a look. So I have these all the code. I have load. Okay, I'm now loading PyCharm. You can't see it, but I will show you in a minute. PyCharm's now loaded or loading. We should where to find the pipe. So I don't know what the PAR guidelines are. I didn't write that bit, but I expect that if you go to the Principle of Programming Ethical Design Principles lecture, you should get that. But in general, what it means is that you design something to not be misleading. But yeah, ask that into Virtual 201. Maybe some of the demonstrators know exactly where it is from, because it's the front end bit that I wasn't involved with. So Flask is not supposed to make your stuff look nice. Flask you're intended to use only to provide your backend. We're trying to minimize the amount of effort that this work should be taking. And there is something that is taking a shitload of processor power from my system. Okay, yes, there it is. It's now getting there. Okay, so it's still loading. I'll answer the questions while it is loading. So what order would you recommend that we work through this assignment? For those of you who actually did exercise 6, I would say start with putting that, but in general I would say the first thing you want to do is make it work from Flask. So upload it into Flask, make it connected to Flask. So to basically say, what will the end thing look like? It will look like this particular page. I should be able to load it in a web browser once it's decided to do so. I might be able to just do that immediately. Oh, okay. Yeah, if I run this might just... Oh, there's an opening browser as well. I don't know what running a page actually means, but it has opened it in a browser. So this is the sample implementation given. I find it a little bit very blue. It can be prettier. One of the things you will notice here is that you have this user and this new user item. In a normal application, you would have those hidden away and pop up when relevant. In this case, that it's perfectly reasonable to keep it as this. If you want to, you can do that. The easiest way is just use the display visibility property on your UI. So this is what it looks like. So you go to the next user, etc. And yeah, you can make it pretty. You can say, okay, I want to actually already make the height of the columns keep a space while the image is loading and stuff like that. You can't. Oh dear. Now you can see. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So this is what it looks like. I preloaded the thing, but I forgot to transition. So now it's there. So that should work now. Still getting used to OBS Studio. Yes, it's a lot of blue. So from the UX perspective, yeah, leave that. And so this is what it looks like. You can press the next page button, the previous button. So this uses the UX from ResRec. This has not the backend. The front end doesn't change depending on the backend. One thing, so yes, I'm not sure we need to look at PyCharm for that, but there is a file that's basically exercise 6. Okay, I'll leave it open for now, but that is the sample answer for exercise 6, but leave that for now. So I'll go back to the question view. So have a look at all. So this is what it's supposed to be look like. You are expected to try and make it look nice. That would mainly involve CSS, say some framework or some CSS framework or other. One of the errors I saw people was that they used the CSS framework directly from the host, and then the host forgot to renew their certificate. In general, it's better to host your code directly from your own server so that you don't get an issue with that. So you put it in your let me show you in PyCharm. So you put it in something like your CSS folder with hosting it as static, as I kind of demonstrated here a little bit. So if you have a CSS folder, then everything goes from there. So you have this kind of root. You should see this from last time, and you can put some styles. So this is the styles and thing. You can put the style in here. And then in your document, you can do something like, okay, link it. So this is a relative URL. You can also have a host relative URL if you put a slash in front of it. Of course, test.html is from the root, so that is the same. So this is how you link to it. You can do the same thing with a JavaScript thing. I think users.html does that. So it does these JavaScript at the end. Again, so this is a relative. You could do it this way, and then it would always go back to the root of the server. And this way, it doesn't matter where you host it from. Wherever the file is, it will. So if it's a file or if it's on the server, it will work. So what order would you work? So the first part that I expect you to do is just make the thing run on Flask. And what you then want to do is just go through the all the bits. So go through your script file, where basically you have something like this, but it's complete with your. So if you did exercise 6, it is complete with all the features, and every part where it says regress, you replace it with your own API by first implementing the API, and then to basically just mirror the regress, and then you want to implement that into your application. So that's what I would say. Start that, and it is just start at the top and work your way down to the bottom. If you didn't do this yet, you just have a layout, because there is a standard layout. You can and doing the making it pretty versus JavaScript are separate tasks. Making pretty, it's something I would reserve to the evening hours where you're a bit tired and you can't really concentrate. That's a good time to do the making pretty bit, because you can making pretty will always eat up your time. There's always some ways you can make it prettier, and it's kind of very hard to stop with that. So if you do it in the evening time, then you'll just do it until you go to bed, and then that's it. So how do you select the deletion thing? So how do we delete a thing? So let's go back to the web page. Yes, you can see that. So the requirement is that you can select a user. So you can select a user. So then you can either. So what you do is you add a click listener on the row, basically, in JavaScript, and then you figure out the user. So there's different ways you can do that. The cheeky way is just, well, getting to this cell. What's the content of this cell? Okay, that's 3. That's the user ID. I go and request the user ID. I put it in this page, where again I have this field that contains the user ID. This one probably should be made read-only. And then when you have the delete user, you can again look up what this user ID is from. So you can put an ID on this tag. So if we go to do the inspector, let's see how this is implemented. The DevTools should be able to tell us. So there is the input with the type user ID. We have an ID. We can just go and in our JavaScript, we can just get the element with this ID, then get the text out of that and make this work. And we might want to do something like that and make it slightly less or something like that to make it slightly less horrible. And there should also be abilities to actually make it uneditable, but I don't remember by heart what the ability was. Enable, nah, it doesn't. There should be some way. You have to look that up. So that's how you do the. So the delete request just gets the user ID and makes that request with the correct URL. And I would advise that your API is compatible with Regress. Some students found that the Regress API and the UI is not consistent. So you can either leave it as is and not really handle with jobs, for example, or you can update the new user dialog to actually do things like allow you to have a URL for an image, or to have and have all the other properties. You can do that. It's not required to make both consistent. It's nice to make it consistent, but not required in this case. However, if you want a new user to work and end up in this list, you might want to add some elements that at least you have something there. And then you can just put a dummy avatar image if you want to. So how do you manipulate the DOM? So there is, I would say the most important tool is the developer tool, so the inspector. So when you want to navigate your DOM, you can just say, okay, I want to do something. So I suppose you click somewhere on this row. So let's go. So this is an element. You can make the table row handle your own click. Okay, yes. So you can have so here is an event listener set click. So you can actually in this tab see the event listeners that are there. So if you click this, it will call this particular script line. There's also a DOM content loaded that does something. So basically every element can or could have a click listener. So there's a click listener here as well. So what you can, so in this case, so what you can do is you can go to things, everything where is an ID. This is a special tag. There is only allowed to be, it has to be unique within the same page. And you can just go from the page towards that. You can also say, okay, I have the table, what are the columns there? So you can either go through it in a semantic way that I showed, where you can have actually table specific methods, or you can just use the elements. So, and then you can say, okay, what is the next, the one with this ID, or which is the fourth one, or find the first child that has a particular tag name, etc. So here you can see which ones there are. User 1, user 2, user 3, user 6. Okay, I know what to do with that. Or if I'm here, I just go to the parent tag. Okay, this is a user tag. Okay, then you go say what's the first child, and just you have to know, oh, this is the text. It is 2. And yes, you can have the default before, so you could actually do something really cheeky and add some so something like you can actually add content to a before tag, but let's leave that as that. So yeah, so you don't get for the exercise. Okay, so that's how manipulating the DOM. Marks for tasks that don't work if the code is along the right tracks. So yes, if you make your code along the right tracks, then you do get some marks of that. So it depends a bit how far you are of the right answer. Is it a stupid oversight, or is it really the wrong kind of approach? So that is for the particular tasks in the brief. We don't assess per se your exercises, even though they build up to this. So if you had an exercise that was wrong, fix it. in general, also, if there's something that you say, okay, this should work, but it doesn't, or there's something really weird happening, ask in Virtual 201. We are there to help you with those things. You can share your screen and stuff, and then we can look at what the code is, and sometimes a new pair of eyes just makes a big difference, especially if you have something as monumentally hard to program as a missing semicolon or an off by one error. Things like that can just be tricky to see because it's just one character in this whole file. Sometimes you just look past the problems. So what you want to do is, if after 15 minutes, half hour, you're still staring at the screen and it doesn't get at you, ask for help. Same time, one thing I would really advise is learn how to use the debugger. So what you can do here is, for example, go to your sources, go to your JavaScript, and just put a breakpoint. Okay, render users. What happens if I render users? Okay, now this puts a breakpoint there. We can see this here as well. Oh, sorry, I need to put it back on. So you go to the sources, you go to the script file. So you put a breakpoint there. That should then give you the ability to, so you can see this, and then it should be, when you then reload your page, or let's say render users should do when we do the thing, it should now be actually here. So we can now see that we are paused. The web page shows we're paused, and we can now step over, step into, etc. So step over goes to the next line. So now we have a table. So here we can see all the locally visible variables. You can also look at this object. You can look at the global variables. So there's global variables. Yeah, it takes. There's a lot of global variables. So if you want to take what is the current selected user, you could just create a property current selected user and set that to a value. So in this case, we have the table, which has a certain property. So it has a lot. This is a built-in HTML thing. So there's a lot of properties we don't care about. You can also add expressions that you care about. In this particular thing, so the console log looks up the table again. We could probably get rid of that. This is the code. This is basically the code I showed you previously, but we didn't do a debug. So you can go just step over it. Remembering the keyboard shortcuts is really helpful, because doing this with a keyboard is so much faster than with a mouse. So you go to the next line and then you do this. So this is how you can go through everything. If you're calling a function, you can do with a step into, that basically goes into that function, rather than giving you the code to go out. So that is so in this case, so this is what happens. This update stuff. We can now actually see already in the web browser that some content has changed. So when we go a little bit through this, we should be able to also so go to a certain line. We'll have a quick look. No, this is step will step inside different bits inside the same line. Let's not do that. So when we go here, yeah, it doesn't have a run to line function, unfortunately. PyCharm might have. So now we have one user. You can see it in the background that it actually has loaded. And I will just resume here so that it does the entire thing. But this is how you can visually figure out what is going on with your JavaScript. Another added benefit for using the DevTools is that it will actually bypass some cache behavior. So it actually will make your caching, your page reload from the server more often. But sometimes it's still stuck. So if you press this Shift or if you press hold and the develop option is there, you can figure out. So you can do a hard reload, which is the shift reload that always works, and you can even do an empty cache and hard reload. And if the page doesn't reload properly, this one is the one you want to do. It is normally only visible if you have the developer tools option open. So if you update something in your code and it doesn't seem to be working on your JavaScript, that is one of the possible options, that it's try to cache it and it's no longer valid. So yeah, so the video will be available later. The live stream will be there basically with playback and recording as YouTube does. I don't hide it away. I may try and edit it, but that takes me a little bit of time. But the full video will be available immediately. The only thing that will change is I will change the preview image to no longer be the announcement, but be just the title slide of the video. So yeah, so you do need to build the API with Flask. That's the only thing you do with Flask. I can't answer the network's questions. That would be unethical for me to do. So demonstrating Flask interacting with JavaScript. So what Flask does, and I'd have to go back to my own implementation of that. So we can run Flask test. This is an incomplete version with a less pretty thing. But let's see how that works. So we can get, okay, we have the, say we have the user's request, the API users. So this is the request. So we can put a breakpoint here and we can run Flask in debug mode. And that should give me a little bit. Let's go, okay. This gives me the URL. And okay, slash users.html should work. Or did I put it in? I might have put it in the root. Yes. And now we see that it's actually stuck. This is stuck because in our JavaScript we were actually invoking Flask. So let's just run this for now and we can actually see what is going on there. So this gets our stuff. Let's open the developer tools. So in our developer tools we have our JavaScript. So we can, this is the files. Let's make this a little bit more visible. So what we find here is that, so let's reload the page. Now we see we have our JavaScript. In this JavaScript we are now creating a web page request. So when we look at Flask, it's all fine, it's just running, the debugger is not active. So in our script, we're now here creating a new request object. We make this request object open a particular URL. This is a get request on the URL API/users/page, whatever the page number is, which is 1 in our case. We can see that from the local scope. And I'm not sure what the true parameter means here. So that will make our request, and so create our request. This again does not yet execute it. So when we go F10, we go to the next line. When we look at Flask, we still see that it has not done anything. then we run again. We define the onload function, so we tell it what needs to happen when it's loaded. So let's put a breakpoint there. So if that is called, we know something what to do about that. And now we are actually going to send this request to the server. And then our JavaScript, so this will just create a send request. Note that we just continue. This request is just created. It will be executed asynchronously by our browser. So when we do go to the next, it goes to the end of init page, but that was where it was called, and end of that, and this goes to the end of the script, and now we are getting into browser specific stuff. So we don't care about that. What we can see now is that Flask has now actually received the request. So we have the request for our page. Okay, oh, yes. To keep things easy, PyCharm has different shortcuts. One thing you can do is you can actually debug inside PyCharm. There is a plugin you can put in your Chrome that allows you to debug web pages. I have it for IntelliJ. I'm not sure if I enabled it for PyCharm. But it is possible to do it, and then of course all the user experience is consistent. So where here in PyCharm we can see the variables here. So it's basically similar functionality. The PyCharm debugger is a little bit more advanced. And basically we get this functionality, so we return the page. And now we see that suddenly our DevTools has popped open again, and we see that we are now here. It has returned the JavaScript has received the result, and now what we say, okay, what is the ready state? So, I want to know what that ready state was. That's where we can use watches. So let's do HHR. That was the name we gave to our XML HTTP request. That's a bit too tedious. So what we want to do is ready state. That was 4. Okay. And what is the XHR status? The status should be 200. So yes, we know we have this. We have a response text. Let's look up what the response text is. Or let's get rid, because another thing that we can do is we can look at the console. So XHR, the response text. That just does a one-off of this. So this is the data. This is the response text that we got. Basically, this big old PyCharm stuff. So we can look at the console here as well. It might be possible to put it in a tab in the bottom. I'm not sure if that's possible. So then we get the object of user. So this has been translated into an object now, and then you can calls the render function users. Here we can say, okay, we go into this function. So this will, because if we go over, we just go to the next line where we go into the render users function. The first actual line that does anything there is line 24. So this will make that work. And no, I can't. Yeah, let me have a quick look if I can actually. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can easily zoom the text size. So no, I don't think I can zoom it. So we'll have to live with it not being very big. But this is basically, so now we are here, and then you do the rendering as I showed you before. So this is how it interacts. So the JavaScript makes a request to the server written in Flask, Python Flask, and the server calculates a response, returns that response. Flask will take care of actually, so Flask, basically what you do here is that you basically tell Flask, when you get a request on this this URL, call this function and then use the result to provide the answer. So you can also say, if you want to have a different response code, you could do a comma, whatever the response code needs to be. There's different response values that it can handle in different ways. So you do that, Flask will receive the request, it will execute the function accordingly, it will then return the result, and then your browser receives that. The browser then calls the onload code once the thing has been received, and the onload code can then handle the whatever was received from that request. That's how it interacts. And that server can be anywhere. That could be Regress, which lives somewhere on the internet we don't know, or it can be on your local computer. But another thing to realize there is that your HTML, so that even if you run Flask on your local computer, there's no reason that it couldn't work, say, from your phone. You figure out your local computer's IP address and go to the right port, it should work. Although I haven't checked that Flask listens to all ports or only on localhost. If it listens only on localhost, then it will not receive those connections. But you can should be able to fairly easy make it listen to all ports by making it listen to port. The IP address 0000 is used to say any port. That's convention that the operating system will respect, and then listen to any port that you have. Be aware that is a security issue if you're not behind the firewall. That's possibly why it says it listens to localhost. But you can open it with your phone and see that it is actually a proper web server, which always makes you feel nicer. Okay. So then how would you display a single user? That is part of the exercise that you need to do. But what you need to do is you make a request to get a single user. So I think I have a little bit of that in the thing. So, but you can first make it work with Regress. That was why those exercises were staged that way. But you could return a single user. Get user list, get user ID. So this is how you could get a single user with the user ID. So you figure out what the user ID is, and then you return that one from your user list. You probably want to have a loop where you actually search the one with that ID rather than that particular index in the list. This looks the user, the fifth user or the user ID's user rather than the position of the user. So you need to fix that. So this is not entirely correct. So what because you do something like for user pause in so how did Python for loops go? Anyway, so you get the idea. We want to have a you want a for loop. You just basically 0 to 0 oh, it's not. Forgot to transition. So yeah, so single user, you get something like here, but you need to figure out which user ID has the position. So we loop through the user list, positions, This one I'm certain does work. So, and then if user list user pause dot what was the ID? So the ID property. Equals user ID found user or int equals user pause. So found user int equals -1. And then instead you do something like found user int and so we don't need to check the range, that particular range anymore. Just need to check that it's bigger or equal to 0. And then we say, okay, we need to, of course, we can actually just stick with this variable rather than needing to use this. So this is a way in which you can do that. So you have a default value that is something, not an index. Okay, yeah. Okay, wants me to get rid of the okay, redundant parentheses. Yes, my Python is a bit rusty, but so this is how you could do that. You don't need to design the API, you can just use the regress API. Creating users, you receive a user and you need to go to the request object to actually, rather than get the args is the query parameters, but when we looked at the documentation for this, we found that we could actually go to the Flask documentation and make this work. So there's a lot of documentation available. So there is so this is the object, which is a base request. So you can navigate to that, or you can go to the Flask documentation. Let me have a look. This is the Flask documentation. There's actually the user guide. We can have a look. So what we want to do is access the request data from our post, and we want to then so the request object has different things. So we can figure out what the method was that was called. You can use if it has been a post, you can get the data out of the form attribute. So if it's a request parameter, so it's in the URL, then we get it from the args, otherwise we get it from the form. So if it's a post or a put, you would get the data from the form attribute as shown here. And of course you do need to provide the right parameters into your post request. That is so that's how you do that, and you might want in your JavaScript. So your JavaScript needs to make a post request, add the data. If you go to so something like the Mozilla, so the MozDev will have a documentation for how to use XML HTTP request and how do you put in the data. So we need to actually go to the actual object rather than the send function. But we can see here already there are examples. So we can see so this is the Okay, let's go back to the previous one and we just go to the example. How do you do a post? So you might set the request header to tell the receiver what format the parameters come in. By default, you might want to use www.form URL encoded, or you want to use text/JSON if you're just sending JSON. So for your put, you might want to use that. And then in your send request, you just put that the data as applicable. So what is form URL encoded? That is exactly the same as you put in a GET request, except it does not have the separating question mark. It doesn't start with a question mark. It starts just with the name, attribute name, value, and then ampersands to do this. But you can send any kind of things. You can send a whole document or JSON or whatever you want. The content type should be appropriate to what you're doing. So that is how you do that. I think there are maybe some tools to help you create that stuff, but you don't actually need to do that. So that's how you would send data. But yes, the video will be available later. Marilyn will be available later. But yes, so yes, it will always be available later. XML JavaScript. So this, yes. So a lot of this is to do with the last lecture that that Susie gave and exercise 6. But exercise 6 was the first week of online learning, so a lot of people were in kind of off mode at that point. And I had also already provided the Python tasks online, so some people skipped the JavaScript exercise. So I'd say go look at that again, because it actually helps you build the assignment up. And the starting bit is the user's code from exercise 1. If you look at exercise 1, it will actually have exactly the code you need. What is going on there? How do you stop pagination running after it run out of data? So let me first have a look at regress. What does it do? So there is 2 parts of pagination. There's the front end and the back end pagination. The back end knows how much data it is. So it needs to figure out what to do if it gets a page that doesn't exist. So what we can actually do here is we can actually give it a different data. So so this is what regress does when you do page 2. I thought it had the ability to actually edit it. Okay, no, I just need to open that URL and do it directly here. So when we change page 2 into page 3, what it does, it returns no data. It still says page per page 6, total 12, total pages 2. So now you figure out, oh, actually, page 3 of 2, that's not valid. So you might want to decide there to do something else than delete all the existing users. Say, okay, actually, there's no users, there's no new page. I'm just forcibly keeping the page on page 2. So where would you do that? You would do that in your onload function. After you've gotten the response here, you can look at from the users object, what was the page that we got? What was the total pages that we got? If that is inconsistent, we might want to not do the render users. If you want to figure out what is in object users, well, put in a breakpoint and then just run it again. So we run the page again and we should be hitting our breakpoint. Oh, yes, it hits our breakpoint in PyCharm again. And then it hits the breakpoints here. So object users, what does it look like? Okay, it has this data. It has page 1, total 2, total per page 6. So there's 2 users, but 6 per page. There's only 1 page. So I know which page I'm trying to load, which is page number. At this point, I'm not sure why it doesn't show. Oh, in this is in the onload one. You could access it if you really wanted it to, but so if you access it in this function, it will be available, but it sees here that you're not actually accessing it anymore, so it will work that, but it's page 1 anyway. So you can use that here to determine, okay, if the page number is bigger than the total pages number in object users, don't do anything. So only do render users if it's smaller. So that's how you could make that work. I think the code that for the example, the sample solution that Tim created, he does a check in the handlers of the give you the next page. The disadvantage of that one is that if somehow the server changed its data underwater, so someone else went and changed the data that wasn't you in a different page, then the data, then that assumption may no longer be valid. Of course, when we look at regress, we know that the data, it will just not return anything in that particular case. For your Python, you may want to check that that works or what it does. Or just have a check. If you're asking for a page bigger than we can have, just return an empty list. So that's how that works. And then we stop the breakpoint. So this is that. So a little bit, this particular part was in a, I think in last week's lecture. How do we connect this up? I think I spent about, it's the 1 hour segment of the lecture videos. So that should really help you to get going. I hopefully also explain how that works. Now you see also a little bit how to do the debugging. By the way, as a trick, if you want to make things look simple, look pretty, sorry, you can it's very easy to go out and actually update your styles here. It is even if you have a CSS file, you can actually store your stuff in the, there's no CSS here at all, but if you had one, there is a trick where you can link it to a file system and then store the stuff after you edit it. But if you want to say, okay, I actually want to make this look a little bit, font family be something like, let's go bitter. And that's the university nice font family. And you can do something like color Alice blue. That sounds really nice. Oh, that's impossible to see. Like blue. Or you can do it even prettier. You can click on this and you get a nice color selector. And I like that one. Or you can select it this way. So this is how you experiment with making things look pretty, but you just want to make sure that this sets it in this attribute, but this is just an in-memory attribute. This is not stored in a file. There's no file in the first place. It's just something that the server sends to the browser. The browser can't just change this file on the server. But you can do this, and if you have a style sheet, you can edit things in the style sheet as well. So when we go to the other users page, let me. I need to open a file here, isn't it? let me have a quick copy path, absolute path. And then we do that. So what we do here, so you can go and inspect this. And then you can see here, okay, we have this W3 CSS file. Let's check, is there another, there's only this W3 style. And yeah, you probably want to download that locally. You know what, I will just update the users file here and we add a style here. Style. How did we do that? Style link style. That's how we did that. You can have an inline style, but so something like test.css. And now if we it should still work, it should load it correctly. Now again, we have the test thing. Oh, it suddenly has more style information because that test file has some style in it. And we can then go in and say, okay, so we have the body element. For example, there is body background here. You can actually change this. So maybe that is not a nice color. We want to do it white. And we can also click on this and see this. We could add stuff in here and say, okay, we want to do so anything that has header 1 or header 2 or header 3 font family, which is bitter. And now all our headings have gotten the bitter font. Or all the ones H3, and then we can in the body do something like font family PT Sans Pro, which is the university's sans font, and that's how you can make it pretty. And you can so this file, obviously you can't do it, but you can save it as, or you can have look at what are the local modifications. You can save this, and if you save it to the actual location of your project, it will actually update this. So this is an easier way of updating it. Of course, if you have a file system, saving will just work correctly directly. So this is how you can much easier see what you're doing and make it look pretty without having to reload and stuff like that. How do you get the second page of users onto the website without writing in HTML? Look at last week's video. I actually show you how to do this. But what does the JavaScript look like? Let's have a look. Very brief look. So this is what I had last week. Is this render function. So when after you made the request to the users, you need to then render it or display it. So what happens here is we get the table. How do we get this table ID? We look at the we look at our page and we look at what IDs we have. In this case, we can look at it here. We could also look at it in the UI. So in this case, we have a table. It has the ID table users. Okay, which one do I need? I need that table users. And then what I delete all the data in that table first. I kept this bit from what Tim provided. And then we're looking at all the users in the data subfield of the users structure. So the user structure has some metadata, and then it has the data field that contains the actual data for the rows. And then we add a row. We set the class name of the row to something. This is using the W3 style with the awful blue. You may want to have a look at what is there, or do your own styling, etc. There's plenty of them around. You don't need to use these styles. So W3 provides some standard classes and stuff like that already for you. And then you can set these variables. So we have a cell. We create a cell in that row. We give it a name. So class name. We create all the cells, and then so every HTML element has this property called inner HTML, where you can just put text that represents HTML. So what is the HTML inside this tag? It happens to be image src plus whatever is the location of the avatar plus that, etc. And you can use, in JavaScript, you can use single or double quotes interchangeably, sort of. You have to match them, but the idea is that if you it's allowed interchangeably, so that other language can use the other quotes, so to speak, without having to do escaping. So this is how you set the inner HTML for that thing, and this is how you update that. And this is much more extensively discussed in last week's lecture, so I'd say watch that. No, you don't need a JSON file. When regress returns a so regress returns that stuff, or your API returns that stuff. When we look at this is what is returned. So if we go and look at page 1, so that is not a JSON file. This is just some data. So it has this additional property, which is some add. The add in this case we don't really care about. You don't need to reproduce that. Thank you very much. So what you but it's for how regress wants to make some money. So basically we have this content. If you open this in Specialist JSON Explorer, you can see it a little bit more pretty. But this is basically the JSON that is returned. This is generated. When we look at Flask in our app.api, so what we have here is a user list, which is that similar data but in a Python literal. So I initialize a list here. You don't have to have an initial list, but it makes your testing so much easier. And then you so this is Python data. This is just an object. This defines an object in Python. And what we do then when we want to display that is we basically call the JSONify function on that. How do I do that? In this case, I make a new object because there's some extra data I need to provide to make it the same as the regress thing. So there's no file here. I just create a Python object that is a dictionary, has these keys per page, 6, with the value 6, page, with the value page number plus 1, because the page number thing that I use starts with 0 rather than with 1. Total amount of pages, users, total amount of pages. I explained in the last video why this is the right calculation, and we return the data, which actually happens to be a slice of the user list. I use a slice because that's fairly easy. So you could do the entire user list to return everything. So this data can update. If you have a create user or a set user, you can update this data. But I would, for now, see, it is helpful to have some hard-coded data in the beginning because that makes your testing so much easier. It is not actually a requirement to do so, but I'd say please provide some initial data so that we can test your application without having to test the new user functionality. And as an added hint, the Python literal syntax is very, very similar to the JavaScript literal syntax. So JSON data would possibly just be able to be put straight in there. And yes, it is possible to have a JSON file you load it from or even save it to. That's additional functionality. You're perfectly welcome to do so. It is not required. There's many ways you could get your data, but yeah. So any other questions at this point? Any other questions? Anything on the unit you say, okay, this is something I don't understand? Okay, one of the things I would still like to add, so one of the things is more a general statement. I find so one of the things to remind everyone is coding is about thinking, and I think some students, and this assignment tries to be a bit limited in that, but one of the things you need to do and get used to is practicing making a plan of attack. How are you going to go about solving a problem? How do you break it down into parts? And that is part of coding. And that is partially also why we don't give you a step-by-step, line-by-line guide on how to do this. Because you kind of want to do that yourself. You take what you learned from doing it in examples and then you translate that in other things. And it involves some experimentation. So what happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? What happens if I do that? So yes, but yes, there is this. So think about your code, and if necessary, write your code first out on paper or in comments, the steps that you're going to take, how you're breaking it down, before you write it into JavaScript or Python. Because that allows you to separate the question about what am I going to write from how am I going to write that. You saw just before that I forgot exactly how do I do a for loop in Python. That's not because I don't know what I need to do. It's because I don't do that much Python. I forgot how I do a for loop over an index in Python. I don't know if the range option is the best way of doing it. I know it does work. It gives me the numbers and that's all I need. There's probably a better way of doing it. But I don't know that one. But so it's the difference between what do you want to do and how do you say that. And when you're a beginner, you are struggling in both. And so you want to separate them out. You want to first write down as a comment, this is what I'm going to do for the entire function, and then translate them one by one. Another thing there is stick with one function. If there are some bits that, oh, I need a function to do that. So if you do things like, okay, in your script, you're going to say, okay, I want to handle this on load and I want to render the users. At the point that you say, okay, I need to have a way of rendering my users. These are the users. You don't want to actually start, okay, oh, I wrote this, now I am immediately going to write render users. No, you finish the current function. Render users might be a red squiggly, leave it, you'll get to that later. So you write and finish the entire function, and then are you going to go back to the red squiggly? You might then say, okay, quick fix it, create me this function. So quick fix is Alt Enter. So that's what you want to do. And yes, your application is a single page application. You do not need to load any other page. Everything is basically the user's page, loads the JavaScript, and the JavaScript will then update your document as you go along. You don't go to another page, and that is the requirement of the assignment. It's a single page application. That doesn't mean that you can't say, okay, I'm gonna now overlay my users list. You can do that. You can do something like we have here, okay, I want to display my users. How would you do that? You can do something like, let me have a look here. So we have the sec user. So in here, what you can do something like, so here it says display block. Okay, maybe I want to do display, I want to do the sec user. I want to have, say, position absolute and background white, border 1px solid, solid black, display block. So now we have a border around the thing, and then we can do something like top is 20px, left is auto, right is auto. Let me look. No, it doesn't center it. So there are some tricks to center stuff. So left equals 20px. We might want to do something like padding 1em, and this is how you can do a pop-up. You can do a background somehow. Just do something like check users. And you can do this in JavaScript. You can set these stuff in JavaScript, or you can create a class in CSS, and you set that class, and that will update this. So you can, or you can have a divider, something like here. You can add a division that just basically is transparent, that hides stuff. So you can have a pop-up for the user if you want it. So this is what you would basically do. These are the styles you can want to have. You would put them in a CSS file and then set the class. So you do something like, okay, styles that. Class is pop-up visible or pop-up invisible. So what you could do, so we do add attribute, class is visible. And then you could go to your CSS and put these style properties. We can just copy paste them out. You can copy this, and then we can, if we go to our CSS file, we can then actually do something like, okay, dot, what was the name of the class that I put there? Pop-up visible, visible, and make that work. Oh yeah, neat. And that would then, when we get rid of this style attribute, it would just still have the pop-up visible, and then we can say, okay, we have a class invisible, and that will undo that one. But what we can also do is then we can create a dot pop-up invisible. Then you do something like display none, and that hides it away. But this is how you could do a pop-up and say, oh, I want to make that work for the other one as well, for new users. Well, what you do is in your JavaScript, you can just set the class property. So we add an attribute, class equals pop-up invisible. And there it's gone, but you still have a single page. So if you then click this, you would then update the you basically set the class of the user pop-up, it becomes visible, and then you have an exit button somewhere that makes it that undoes that class. And you may also want to have something that puts some background on the thing. So there's different ways in which you can make that work, and play around a little bit with with CSS to make that work, and with JavaScript. So that's kind of what you can do with your, and doing this in in your browser with the editor is really helpful. Just remember, this is not saved by default, so you probably want to make sure you save it somehow. So when I do Control S, it won't actually save it. It's to the server. It shouldn't be. When we look here, this is our test.css rather than this. You can copy paste that, and then you have the whole style. Again, it also hasn't updated the user's HTML to have those class attributes, etc. So that's what you can do. So, anything else at this point? I think I covered all the questions, hopefully. Okay, so any other questions? If it's something that is kind of about how do you do this and in other people might benefit, use Piazza. If you get stuck, there's virtual P201, basically the same kind of stuff you would do in the lab. But again, if it's one thing there, try to ask specific questions. Like say, rather than I'm stuck, can someone help me? It's helpful for us if we know a little bit what you're stuck with. Okay, so otherwise I'll be around in virtual P201. I think there's some time that you're supposed to be using next for PMT, but we'll do question and answers as they are. I might just create videos when people put in questions instead. Okay, thank you very much. So I'll leave with this, unless there's something else. Okay, thank you very much.